Hi students, here is the recording for the digestive system, and I have about 18 slides. So the way I like to present this is to take a look at the organs of the digestive system and associate the function with the structure. That usually makes it easier to understand. So we'll start with the first slide, which has a question, why we eat. And I think most of you would agree that we obtain energy, we can get micronutrients, we enjoy eating. And this last point here, let me just grab a pointer. Cellular respiration is really key because the two reactants, glucose and oxygen, we already discussed how the body receives oxygen when we did the respiratory system. And of course, glucose, which is the only monomer, the only substance that cells can use for cellular respiration, can only be provided by the ingestion, taking in carbohydrates and having the digestive system break down carbohydrates to produce glucose as an end product. Without cellular respiration, basically cells will die. And more importantly, ATP has to be generated for the hundreds of reactions that goes on in some cells so that the whole body functions as a whole. For our discussion at this level, we will be focusing on three of the most important biomolecules. So that would be carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids or fat. The word can be used interchangeably. And you met these in Bio 1150. When we were looking at the very start of the term, you would have studied these biomolecules, looking at the fact that they are all polymers, very, very large chemical structures, and they are built from individual monomers. Usually the monomers, if we take carbohydrates for example, this could represent one glucose unit, and that is chemically bonded to another glucose unit. And by doing so, hundreds of glucose units can be bonded together, chemically bonded together. And that new product that consists of hundreds of monomers chemically bonded together is our macromolecule. And in the case of carbohydrate, the macromolecule that we consume is starch. So starch is present in rice, it's present in wheat flour, it's present in potato. Starch is a storage product of glucose in plants, if you remember that. So when we take a bite of pizza, you know, the crust is starch. That's what we're eating. These macromolecules, if we ask the question, why do we have a digestive system? The macromolecules are physically too large and they're chemically too large to enter cells and to be of any use to the cell. So they all have to be broken down, and that's why we have a digestive system. So there are two processes that we're going to have to talk about in the digestive system. But before we get to that, I have 3 slides that basically show this information about how carbohydrates will be digested. So like I just said, glucose is the monosaccharide, it's the monomer from which carbohydrates, starch for example, is built. Now remember, glycogen is the storage product. Glucose gets converted to glycogen in the liver. And again, glycogen you would have met when you did macromolecules in Bio 1150. So starch is a storage product in plants, glycogen in animals. Typically we don't consume glycogen, we consume starch. But glycogen, because it's stored in the liver, can be a source of glucose. And that's actually what happens when we are fasting. So if we're not eating, blood glucose level needs to be kept at a normal level, and glycogen in the liver is broken down to glucose, usually using the hormone glucagon. So you should know this because glucagon was discussed when we did the endocrine system. So that was just for clarity. Now, the one thing I want you to note is that there's usually not one single enzyme that can break down starch, the macromolecule, to give you the end product. Usually there are many different enzymes. As you can see here, one is called salivary amylase. Then we have these, lactase. So remember that if it has an A's ending, it's an enzyme. If it has an O's ending, it's a sugar, generally in biology. So there could be many steps to getting to the final monomer. These galactose and glucose and fructose are monosaccharides also. So these flowcharts, you can come back to them when you're trying to understand, which enzymes are involved. So typically, we will speak about two types of digestive processes, chemical digestion and mechanical digestion. And mechanical simply means breaking the food up into small particles so that the enzymes can work better. So for example, in the teeth, chewing the food, that's mechanical digestion. Chemical digestion is the use of not chemicals, but the use of enzymes, specific enzymes. So remember that enzymes are proteins, therefore they work at our body temperature. They also work at specific pH. So the pH in the mouth, for example, is about 6.8 to 7, almost neutral. This enzyme, it's named salivary amylase because it's contained in saliva normally, naturally. And so if we consume starch, then the enzyme will begin the digestion of starch in the mouth. So the location where these macromolecules are going to be digested is also a point you need to take home with you. But getting back to chemical digestion, it's very important that you remember that with the use of enzymes, a new product is formed. So here we see that starch will be broken down to maltose by salivary amylase. Now, something like lactose, for example, that might be in a glass of milk that you had with your, it's a sugar. It's present in milk, it's present in some dairy foods. That can only be digested by an enzyme called lactase. Similarly, you might have had a cup of coffee or tea with your meal, and so you added some sugar, which is sucrose. And all of these, maltose, sucrose, and lactose, are what are called disaccharides, meaning they're made up of two monomers. Di means two. Which two monomers? Well, sucrose is made up of one glucose unit and one fructose unit, whereas maltose is made up of two glucose units chemically bonded together. And similarly, lactose is made up of glucose and galactose chemically bonded together. So chemical digestion of polysaccharides, which is starch, and anytime you see the prefix amyl, that refers to starch, generally. So amyl is present in front of the word amylase, which tells you that this is an enzyme that will digest starch. Notice that this word salivary tells you that this is amylase in saliva, because later we will meet amylase again, but it's not salivary amylase, it is coming from the pancreas. So it will be called pancreatic amylase. Okay, now saliva in the mouth also helps to moisten the food. The food can't really remain dry. That would be very difficult to swallow. And saliva also has a bit of mucus in it. It has lysozyme, which you would have met when we did the first line of defense for the immune system also. So saliva isn't just spit. It actually has very important functions in the oral cavity. Now, this is a similar chart for protein. So I want you to know that The end product of protein digestion is amino acids. That should be a reminder to you. And again, there are many steps in the process to go from the protein that might be the pepperoni on your pizza that you chew. To get to the amino acids, many enzymes, and proteins actually require many different enzymes. I think the largest group of enzymes involved in the digestive process handle protein digestion. Okay, now proteins are successively broken down into their amino acid monomers. The chemical digestion of protein begins in the stomach, so not the mouth, using pepsin and hydrochloric acid. So I think we all know that that stomach is a very acidic environment. So this is an example of how the pH changes as we go through the digestive tract. Now pepsin works just fine as an enzyme in an acidic environment. Will pepsin work in the mouth? No, because the pH is totally different in the mouth. So the proteins also will end up, after they're sort of semi-digested, all of these have to get to the small intestines. So that's where the final stages of digestion will occur, but it's also where another process called absorption will occur. And I will be describing those in detail. Now, on the slide, the only thing I want you to sort of remember is that lipids, the breakdown product, are fatty acids. Okay, you can read the other information, yes, because you do need to know that, but the focus here is, when we consume fat, for example, butter, what is the end product? The end product should be fatty acids. And you should also be asking yourself, what do the cells use these end products for? We know glucose is used for cellular respiration, but what are amino acids used for? So remember that enzymes are enzymes are proteins. Some hormones are proteins. Hemoglobin is a protein. So cells can use these 21 different amino acids from the proteins that we eat to make whatever their job is, whatever they're supposed to make. And same thing with fatty acids. Fatty acids can be combined to form fat, which can be used as insulation. But the phospholipid bilayer of plasma membrane is also, does require lipids, fatty acids. So all of the end products are used by cells to maintain their health, but also to, produce products that the cells require. So there are many names given to the digestive processes, and so you are expected to know the names. And the first one is ingestion, which simply means putting food in the mouth. That's all it means. Propulsion is, well, as you might imagine, moving the food from one location to the other. So if we think about the digestive system, here's what I would like you to consider. It begins at the mouth, it ends at the anus, and so it's this long passageway through, the body. And when we have food in this passageway, this food is not really in the body, because that food could make its way all the way down to the anus very quickly. Some of us have had that experience. So the way that food, the nutrients, get into the body is this word here. They have to be absorbed. And as the arrows show, this is trying to show you absorption. This is a stomach here, and after the stomach comes the small intestine, and these arrows are showing you that stuff is moving out of the GI tract. So the digestive system could also be called the GI tract. That's this passageway. Gastrointestinal tract. It can also be called the alimentary canal, and I'm not going to write that whole word out. You can look it up. Alimentary canal. But the nutrients, for us to benefit from the food we eat, the nutrients must move out of this alimentary canal and into what is not shown here, blood vessels. And that process is what's called absorption. And that occurs in the small intestine only. So the movement of the food generally would be called propulsion, but how does the propulsion occur? Well, there's a process called peristalsis, which I will explain in a couple of slides to you, a specific process that moves food along the digestive tract. Because, I mean, we're all aware that once we swallow the food, we don't control the movement anymore. Yet the food moves along and, eventually, the undigested food is what we call feces, and that has to be eliminated from the body. So the two processes, mechanical digestion and chemical digestion, I will be referring to throughout this narration, because for each organ that the food is essentially passing through, we want to ask these two questions. Does mechanical digestion occur in that location? Does chemical digestion occur in that location? And if so, which of the macromolecules is being mechanically digested or chemically digested? So, mechanical digestion is taking the large piece, because we bite, a mouthful usually of food, and to break it down into small, tiny particles as possible. And you really save your stomach a lot of work if you chew your food properly. And I think the average, you're supposed to chew a mouthful about 30 times before you swallow. Because by creating smaller pieces, the enzymes can surround the small pieces and they can digest it much better. So you get greater benefit out of the food that you've eaten. Teeth aren't the only thing that can help with mechanical digestion. The tongue helps to, it's a very muscular organ. It helps to move the food around. Saliva helps to moisten the food. The jaw, we have muscles like the masseter for opening and closing. And in the stomach, we will see that the stomach actually does do a lot of mixing, something that is called churning. So watch for the new terms. And like I said, chemical digestion is the use of enzymes to break chemical bonds and produce new product, a new chemical product. So with mechanical digestion, there is no new product. All you get is a smaller piece of the original. And absorption is removing the transport of the final monomers from the alimentary canal, from the GI tract into blood capillaries, and also lymphatic capillaries in the small intestine. And of course, we all know what defecation is. So here are the organs. The mouth, carbohydrate begins chemical digestion, as we said, using salivary amylase. Then the food will move to the pharynx, which is also called the throat. There's no digestion occurring there. Then it moves into a long tube called the esophagus. So this here is the esophagus. The esophagus is posterior to the trachea. And the other thing to note is the name of the food changes as we go along this passageway. I will be reminding you of that as we go along. From the esophagus, the food moves to the stomach. So the stomach is on the left side of the body. And there are 3 accessory organs that are part of the digestive system. Now, the food does not travel through these, which is why they're called accessory organs. The other reason they're called accessory organs is because they produce a substance which assists in the digestion of food. So the food does not pass through the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. So from the stomach, the food goes to the small intestine. It's important to remember. So what do we get from the liver? Well, the liver makes bile. Bile is a greenish liquid that helps to digest lipids, and lipids only. Bile is not an enzyme. The bile is made by the liver, but it is stored in the gallbladder. So when it's released, and it's usually released into the first part of the small intestine, it is coming from the gallbladder. The pancreas, which is inferior, and you can barely see a little piece of it here in this diagram, it is inferior to the stomach. The pancreas we met as an endocrine gland already because it produces 2 hormones, insulin and glucagon. But it is also an exocrine gland. It produces all of the last digestive enzymes that are required to digest all three food groups. So this product coming from the pancreas is sometimes referred to as pancreatic juice, but what it is, whenever we hear this word juice being used, or what it really says is that this is a solution that it's a mix of many different things. That's what it means. So in the pancreatic juice that's coming from the pancreas, we have enzymes that can finish the digestion of carbohydrate, protein, and lipids, fats. Additionally, there's one other substance, but I'll save that for later. That's really important, and it comes from the pancreas. Small intestine, it's a substance that has to do something with pH. So in the small intestine, the chemical digestion of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins must be completed. If for some reason a person does not have one of these enzymes, they don't produce one of the enzymes that are necessary, like for example, some people do not produce the enzyme lactase, therefore they cannot digest lactose, then that food, the lactose in milk that they drank, is still going to be present in the large intestine because the food moves next to the large intestine. So the small intestine is really, really important. It is incredibly long, many, many feet long, because both digestion has to occur there, the final stages of digestion, and absorption of the nutrients. If the nutrients aren't absorbed, so these would be the glucose from carbohydrate, fatty acids from the lipid, and amino acids from proteins, if they are not absorbed into blood and lymphatic capillaries, they will end up in the large intestine. If they end up in the large intestine, they will be sent to the rectum and eliminated with feces, which would not be a good thing, because what that means is you're consuming food, but you're not actually getting the benefit of the nutrients that are present in the food that you've eaten. So this diagram, you should be able to label it in your sleep. Make sure you know where the organs are located. Just want to point out that the small intestine is much, much longer than the large intestine. So it is usually coiled up, centrally located, usually, both in the body and on a diagram. It sort of has a more smooth, these coils are very smooth because that's how you recognize it from the large intestine, which is this one, which has like this pocketed sort of, arrangement. And this here is the large intestine right there. And we'll have another picture on the slide later. So the large intestine, the tube, has a wider diameter than the small intestine. So that's why it's called the large intestine. Okay, so now for both the anatomy, the physiology, as we go through the organs of the digestive system. So the mouth includes the lips, tongue, palate, gums, and teeth. We don't generally ask questions about, the different types of teeth. So I wouldn't worry about that if I were you. So the oral cavity is separated from the nasal cavity by the hard and soft palate. The hard palate is bone. The soft palate is more muscular tissue. The soft palate extends a little bit to give you the uvula, which is that thing that hangs down at the back of your throat when you say ah. When we swallow, the tongue presses up against the hard and soft palate, and the uvula also moves upwards, so it blocks off the opening to the respiratory passageway. And that prevents food and liquid from entering the nasal cavity when we swallow. We know that we have taste buds on the tongue to detect the 5 main flavors, and lymphatic tissue is strategically located, so we have tonsils. This is no surprise. This was mentioned in the lymphatic and immune system. And so again, we know that bacteria, microorganisms, infectious agents can only get into the body if they can get in through openings, Well, unfortunately, the mouth represents a very big opening through which bacteria can get into the body. So having the tonsils strategically located, in the sort of oral cavity. So we've got the palatine tonsil and the lingual tonsil. There's a third one, but you can't see it when the mouth is open, which is why it's not mentioned here. But these are all found at the back of the oral cavity within the pharynx or the throat. This slide focuses a little bit on the salivary glands. So there are three of them. There is the parotid, and then there's the one under the jaw, submandibular, and the one under the tongue, sublingual. So these are exocrine glands, right? Remember, exocrine glands have a duct, so you can see the duct or the passageway so that the saliva can go into the oral cavity proper. Technically speaking, the oral cavity is the area that's enclosed by the teeth. So it doesn't include that space between the lips and the gum, actually. But that's a minor point. The three salivary glands produce slightly different types of saliva. One is more thicker than the other, that sort of thing. But bottom line is saliva has the function of, keeping the oral cavity moist. It has the enzyme salivary amylase. So the digestion of starch begins in the mouth. The digestion of protein and lipids does not begin in the mouth. Salivary amylase, when it works on starch, when it digests starch, it will produce maltose. So maltose is a type of sugar. Now you could actually do a little experiment to test this out. You can take a saltine cracker, preferably without a lot of salt on it, but just a plain cracker, so nothing with sugar in it, and chew it for about 10 minutes. In the process, when you're chewing, don't swallow. So you really keep chewing, moistening it with the saliva. Eventually you will need to swallow it. But you will see that after a few minutes, you will have a very sweet taste in your mouth. That's the maltose that you're tasting. Now we will swallow, which is entirely voluntary. And that food that we swallow, it's a lump. And that lump has a name. It is called a bolus. So this bolus moves now from the oral cavity to the pharynx, which is the throat, and the pharynx is then connected to the esophagus, which is this very long passageway here. So this is a part of the stomach being shown here. So that's the long passageway. This would be the diaphragm. So the stomach is inferior to the diaphragm. The esophagus has to perforate the diaphragm, and the bolus will move from the pharynx into the esophagus. Notice that the trachea is shown here anterior to the esophagus. And last week you learned that when we swallow, the epiglottis covers the glottis, which is the opening to the respiratory passageway. And that prevents food going down into the wrong passageway. So the food needs to move from the oropharynx to the laryngopharynx, because the pharynx is a region that's shared between the respiratory and digestive system, right? And the glottis, which is the opening to the trachea, needs to be closed off so the food does not go down there. Now, the esophagus is the beginning of this long tube that is really the alimentary canal or the GI tract. And this tube has 4 layers of tissue from the beginning of the esophagus to the anus. It is modified along the way. So for example, for the stomach, it has become enlarged so that it can hold food, right? Roughly about 1 gallon of food. And so we need to understand the structure of this passageway, because there's a space which is called the lumen. That's the space that the food, the bolus, will be coming down there. What is the first layer that touches the food? That would be this one, the mucosa. So the mucosa is the number one layer that touches the food. The other layers do not touch the food. Now, the mucosa is basically epithelial tissue. Beneath the mucosa is what is called another layer, the submucosa, because sub means underneath. So beneath the mucosa is the submucosa, and this one is really important because the submucosa actually has blood vessels. You can sort of see them here, red and blue. There are also nerves, which is actually being shown in yellow, and there's actually lymphatic capillaries also. One of the most important layers is this one, the third layer, the muscularis layer. Why? Because it has a band of circular muscle. So circular muscle will go all the way around the tube. Now this is not skeletal muscle. This is smooth muscle. And if you remember, smooth muscle is involuntary, meaning we don't control it. And this is the layer that helps to move the bolus along, the propulsion that I was referring to earlier. So there is a layer of smooth and there is a layer of longitudinal. So between these two, when they contract and relax in a rhythmic way, they propel the bolus along the passageway. We have a lot of nerves, actually, nerve plexuses that are integrated into the alimentary canal, but in our discussion, we really don't talk that much about them. And the last layer is actually what is called a serosa, which is here. It's the outermost layer, a serosa. So let's move to this slide, peristalsis. So this is showing you that the bolus, this lump of food, is now in the esophagus. So this is the tube, this is the lumen where the bolus is. These are the walls here of the 4 layers with the 4 layers there. And the bolus is obviously touching the mucosa layer. It doesn't touch the others. But the third layer, because the second layer would be the submucosa, the third layer is the muscularis. So the circular muscle and the longitudinal muscle. And so the circular muscle, when it contracts, will create this effect, right, where you kind of squeeze, right, the area in. And the longitudinal muscle, when that contracts, it will actually shorten this a little bit. So that helps to propel the food along. So this process is called peristalsis. And so peristalsis occurs throughout the digestive tract. It begins in the esophagus. And this is how the food moves along. So the pharynx is continuous with the esophagus. When you swallow, the trachea moves up and under the epiglottis so that food and liquid move toward the esophagus. We said that already. What we did not say is this word here, sphincter. What is a sphincter? So the circular layer of smooth muscle can become condensed, thickened, to form a structure that's called a sphincter. And a sphincter functions like a valve. And you met valves in the cardiovascular system, and valves help to control the flow of something in the cardiovascular system. It was controlling the flow of blood. Here, the sphincter is controlling the flow of the food. So there is a sphincter here called the upper esophageal sphincter. But more importantly, there is one here guarding the entrance. So think of them as guards, guarding the entrance of the stomach. The lower esophageal sphincter. Now, some books call this the cardioesophageal sphincter because this area is close to the heart. But that's what a sphincter is, and make sure you can spell the word sphincter. There are other sphincters present in the alimentary canal. So as we go through, I will point them out. So that bolus, we swallow, bolus moves down, we chew some more, we swallow. And so The boluses are arriving in the stomach. Notice that no chemical digestion occurs in the esophagus, no mechanical or chemical actually. The esophagus is really just a passageway. And peristalsis is not breaking the food down, it's just moving the food, the bolus. So what happens when we get to the stomach then? Well, here is where we will have the cardioesophageal sphincter. The first thing to note is that there's another sphincter here called the pyloric, right there. So this area here outlines the entire stomach, and that is the beginning of the small intestine. So the beginning of the small intestine has a name, and it's called the duodenum. The duodenum. That's the beginning part of the small intestine. So there are 3 parts to the small intestine, and so you need to know the correct sequence in which these parts, are named, because that's the sequence in which the food will travel through. So we have a stomach which functions kind of like a bag that expands. It is able to expand because in here we have what are called rugae. So rugae are folds of the mucosa layer. Now do not confuse this rugae with folds that I will be talking about in the small intestine. This here is simply like a pleated sheet, so that when the stomach needs to expand to hold more food, it simply can do that. The urinary bladder functions on the same principle, and it is also called rugae in the urinary bladder. So rugae is simply, it's kind of like extra mucosa, so that it allows the stomach to expand. So that's one function of the stomach. Now, more importantly is this, that the stomach has an extra layer of smooth muscle. You see that oblique layer there? So it not only has a longitudinal layer and a circular layer, it also has an oblique layer. Oblique means diagonal. So here are the, 3 layers. 1, 2, 3. It is the only organ in the digestive system that has this extra layer of smooth muscle. So the question is why? What is it that the stomach has to do that this extra layer of smooth muscle will help with? And the answer to the question is this. What arrives is a lump, like a solid lump of food, the one that you swallowed. What will be leaving the stomach is a liquid, something that's called chyme. So here again, the name of the food changes. Chyme is like a soupy liquid that will be squirted out in small amounts, roughly about 3 mL, into the duodenum. So the stomach then has the job of churning, breaking, mixing, cracking up this bolus so that chyme will be produced in the end. So the extra layer of muscle helps exactly with that. So all 3 food groups, carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids, will undergo mechanical digestion in the stomach because they're all there, and the stomach is simply going to crush, move, shove the food back and forth, all of that. The food stays in the stomach for a couple of hours, but it depends on how complex the meal was. So if you had a meal that had, carbohydrate, like potato, then you had protein, maybe a steak, and then you had vegetables, which have a lot of fiber, etc. That's a complex meal, as opposed to if you had, a cupcake, which is just some sugar and flour and maybe butter. The cupcake would be digested rather quickly and you'll be hungry again. So that's the job of the stomach. Now, let's read what it says here. The stomach has an additional layer of oblique, smooth muscle. This gives the muscularis layer of the stomach the wall to vigorously churn and mix food. Here's the other important part. So, really important point about the stomach there. Here's a second important point. Proteins and only proteins begin chemical digestion in the stomach. The enzyme that does that is the enzyme pepsin. And whenever you see the prefix pep, it usually refers to protein, pepsin, peptides, peptidase. These all help you to remember that pepsin refers to protein. So again, proteins cannot be digested to amino acids directly. They have to be broken down into like a smaller protein. And a smaller protein, if it's about 50 amino acids, we would call it a polypeptide. So again, the polypeptide has to go to the small intestine in order to complete its digestion. But there's a little bit more to know about the stomach, and that's on this slide. So the stomach produces a solution that is called gastric juice. So again, it's a juice. It's a mix of many different substances. And gastric always refers to the stomach. If we take a small section of the stomach wall and magnify it, this is what the image would look like. We would see these pits. And those pits are what are called gastric pits. But if you go down the pits, what you find is there are cells, different types of cells lining the wall of the pit. And that is what's shown on this part over here. So what are these cells and what do they do? Well, let's see. The stomach wall is adapted for the functions of the stomach. In the mucosal layer, gastric pits lead to gastric glands that secrete gastric juice. What is present in gastric juice? Well, you will find, first of all, pepsin, the enzyme. That would be one thing. You would also find hydrochloric acid, because pepsin actually requires hydrochloric acid to become activated. So that's two things present in gastric juice. The other thing is, since the stomach has hydrochloric acid in the stomach has a very low pH. The pH is actually 2 to 3. That's very, very low. And, if I took you to the lab and I took hydrochloric acid that has a pH of 2 to 3 and I drop some of it on your skin, right away, the tissue will be digested. You would very quickly have, damage on your skin. So this very low pH and the production of acid could damage the stomach wall. But the stomach wall is actually prevented from being damaged by cells which produce, some of these cells here, they produce a very, very thick type of mucus, which coats the inside of the stomach, coats the stomach wall, and that helps to prevent digestion. I should tell you that because we are constantly eating and chewing and swallowing, cells in the digestive tract that line the wall of the digestive tract, the epithelial cells that come in contact with food, they're replaced roughly like every, 3 to 5 days. So a lot of mitosis that has to go on because they become damaged from the abrasion of the food going down. So this one, the enteroendocrine cell, that actually produces a hormone called gastrin. So there are hormones involved in the digestive system, but at this level of learning, we don't get into all of those details. So we focus on sort of the most important pieces that you need to know. So the remaining parts of the, wall of the stomach, it stays the same. Right? The submucosa, the muscularis externa with an extra layer of oblique muscle, and then the serosa. But you can see, that there are blood vessels, right? Shown here in red and blue. And these are all cells. They have to carry out cellular respiration. They need oxygen, which comes in the blood. And they also need their toxic byproduct to be taken away. And they also need glucose. So it should be no surprise that there is an abundant blood supply. Now, we have chyme as the name of the food that's going to leave the stomach. And remember, it's like a soupy liquid. So all of it does not enter the small intestine at the same time. Small amounts, like I said, 3 to 5 mils, is usually sort of squirted out. So having those two sphincters, the cardioesophageal sphincter and the pyloric sphincter, closes off the stomach. So the food can stay in the stomach and only small amounts will leave at any one time. Now, the small intestine has three parts, and here are the three parts. The first part is the duodenum, the second is the jejunum, and then the third is the ileum. And notice that they're of different lengths. So the purple here shows the duodenum. Jejunum is slightly longer, but the longest part is the ileum. And so if you're asking yourself, well, why is the small intestine so long? Remember that both digestion and absorption have to occur here. So we don't want the food rushing through quickly, first of all, whether it's long or short. We don't want the food rushing through. And secondly, if it was short, then that doesn't give the food lots of time for it to be absorbed. Absorption is a fairly complex process. And if we're going to get the benefit out of the food that we've eaten, then we want absorption to be very efficient. So the duodenum receives then chyme, which is partially digested food. Remember, at this stage, carbohydrates might have been partially digested, proteins might have been partially digested, but nothing has happened yet to lipids. Lipids wait until they get to the small intestine when they're going to be digested by, there's one enzyme that you should probably know the name of, and it's called pancreatic lipase, right? So pancreatic lipase, Lipase. And so the name alone should tell you that it's an enzyme, it's made by the pancreas, and it will only digest lipids. But pancreatic lipase will convert lipids to fatty acids. That's their monomer. So the duodenum, the beginning of the small intestine, then gets, chyme coming from the stomach. That's one thing. But how is the process going to be efficient and ensure that all three food groups are completely digested in the small intestine? Well, this is where the accessory organs now help. So we know that on this side, we had, not up in the arm, but obviously to the right, we had the liver making bile. And then we had the gallbladder, which is actually found on the underside of the liver, literally like pasted onto the liver. The bile is stored in the gallbladder. So when food actually arrives in the chyme arrives in the duodenum, bile is secreted, and bile breaks down lipids. Bile performs the mechanical digestion of lipids. Because bile is not an enzyme, what bile is able to do is break the lumps of fat, because fat likes to stick together. So break the lumps of fat into very small particles, very small globules, and that would allow pancreatic lipase to work more effectively. So the stomach is over there, somewhere over here, but remember we have the pancreas right here. So the pancreas also sends its pancreatic juice right into the duodenum also. So now we have the food, we have bile, we have the enzymes from the pancreas. And remember, the pancreas produces enzymes, many different enzymes that can digest the partially digested carbohydrate, the partially digested protein. So a healthy liver, a healthy gallbladder, and a healthy pancreas is really what you need in order for digestion to be completed in the small intestine. So some of those, unfortunately, when I'm recording, I can't go backwards to slides. So some of those enzymes that you saw on the first slide for carbohydrates, here they are. Lactase, sucrase, maltase, they are produced by the pancreas. And that all helps with the digestion of the three food groups. So I don't think there is anything else I have to tell you. here about digestion. Now, if we take a look at absorption, so assuming all the food has been digested to monomers, to their monomers, so we have amino acids, we have glucose, and we have fatty acids, and they need to be absorbed. How are they going to be absorbed? Well, the small intestine has a structural modification that helps it to absorb the food, which means move it from the alimentary canal into blood vessels. And the small intestine has structures called villi. So the walls of the small intestine actually is not sort of flat, it's actually folded. And that folding allows it to have a very large surface area for absorption to occur. And on those big folds, there are little folds also. And those little folds are what are called villi. So villi is what's shown here. There are finger-like projections from the wall of the small intestine. And within villi is where we find red and blue are blood vessels, and green lymphatic vessels. So there's abundant villi and abundant blood vessels and lymphatic capillaries. So the food, for example, would be slushing around here because now it's this liquid, right? All the amino acids, etc., are in this kind of medium, where the individual monomers, one glucose molecule, can cross the membrane and move into blood. And just as how that one could do so, a million can do so. So the bottom line is this, that the surface of the small intestine contains folds and finger-like projections. Only the finger-like projections are called villi. Within each villi are blood capillaries, and blood capillaries absorb glucose and amino acids. This is important to remember. The blood capillaries do not accept fatty acids. Fatty acids are polar. Blood has plasma, which is water, which is polar. The two don't like each other. So, alongside the blood capillaries are lymphatic capillaries, and the lymphatic capillaries are called lacteals. The reason they're actually called lacteals is because when the fat goes in, it started to look milky, so they decided to call them lacteals. So the word lacteals is only applied to lymphatic capillaries present in the small intestine. So they absorb the fatty acids, and now these monomers are basically in blood if it's glucose and amino acids. So where are they going to go from here? They don't go circulating all around the body. If you remember from the cardiovascular system, there was a special circulation from the small intestine to the liver. And that special circulation was called the hepatic portal vein. So the hepatic portal vein has the highest concentration of glucose after a meal. It also has the highest concentration of amino acids, assuming, of course, you had carbohydrate and protein in your meal. But it has the highest concentration of amino acids after a meal also. So these blood vessels in the small intestine, they all send their blood to the liver via the hepatic portal vein. Do not confuse this with the hepatic vein. The hepatic vein is a blood vessel, it's a vein that drains the liver and has nothing to do with the transport of nutrients from the small intestine to the liver. So the glucose goes to the liver, and the liver converts it to glycogen for storage. Amino acids goes to the liver, and the liver uses it to make some things like fibrinogen. If you remember, fibrinogen was a clotting protein found in blood plasma. Albumin was another protein found in blood plasma. Question is, what happens with the lymphatic capillary that has the fatty acids? Well, remember, lymph gets returned to the cardiovascular system. So eventually the fatty acids do make their way to the liver also. And this is what absorption sort of looks like in the liver. Sorry, in the small intestine. So from the small intestine then, so the small intestine is shown here in pink. The junction of the small intestine, so you see the word ileum there, is right here. And there is another sphincter. So that sphincter is called the ileocecal valve. Ileocecal valve. The first part of the large intestine is named the cecum. So you need to know the order, the sequence again, in which the undigested food, because that is all that should be entering the large intestine, is food that has not been digested. So, for example, the fiber in vegetables, the cellulose is what is plant material. And we don't have an enzyme to digest cellulose. Cows do. Animals that can eat grass, they do. But we don't. So, but fiber is important because it actually helps with the movement of the food through the GI tract. So, the ileum also has attached to it the appendix, which has been given, a role. Supposedly, it has some lymphatic tissue in it, maybe some T cells and B cells and macrophages. But the food, the undigested food, which we can now call feces, moves into the cecum and then the ascending colon, moves across, transverse colon, down, descending colon. There's a little S shape here, which is why this is called the sigmoid colon, and then it is stored in the rectum until the urge for defecation occurs, the defecation reflex, and then that would move out. So the question is the large intestine only for, transport of feces? And the answer is no. The main function of the colon is to absorb water. This is actually really important. So the absorption of water, again, helps with, water balance in the body, and that also helps to solidify the feces. I mean, if that didn't happen, we'd probably have like diarrhea all the time. So absorption of water is really important. More importantly, one thing that we don't talk a lot about at this level also is the fact that there are a lot of good bacteria and some bad, but good bacteria living in the colon. And the good bacteria produces vitamins B and K for us. They actually make it. There's a lot of research showing that the type of bacteria that is present in the colon is a reflection actually of how healthy we are. So certain types of bacteria present in the colon, and there are hundreds of them, they have all been sort of discovered and named. There's a lot of research on this right now, because what is being found out is that the product from these bacteria, whatever they make, so for example, they make something called short chain fatty acids. These are required by some cells, maybe of the immune system. They might be required by the brain cells, etc. So if you read information about that, it is not maybe a hoax, it is quite true. So the large intestine is where all of this needs to happen. So again, the food shouldn't necessarily pass very quickly through this passageway. It should sort of take its time to allow the microorganisms to do their part for us, and then it can leave. So the rectum stores feces prior to defecation, and of course the movement, the propulsion, is by peristalsis. So this is the last slide, which is focusing on the accessory organs of the digestive tract. There's nothing here that I haven't discussed already, except I want to focus a little bit more on the pancreas, because this here is the point I was going to make earlier, and I said I would tell you it later. Remember that chyme coming from the stomach is acidic, and we have all of these enzymes from the pancreas, which will help to digest the food to the end products. But these enzymes do not work at an acidic pH. So the chyme has to be neutralized. The acidic pH has to be neutralized. And so in pancreatic juice, apart from the enzymes, so here's pancreatic amylase, there's another one called trypsin that will digest proteins, and then pancreatic lipase digests lipids. But for these enzymes to work, we also need bicarbonate ions. So pancreatic juice contains bicarbonate ions, which bicarbonate ions are alkaline, and so they neutralize the chyme so that these enzymes can work properly. So that takes me to the end of this narration, and I hope it was informative and helpful to you.